Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
The Indo-Canadian relationship. It's complicated, to use social media lingo. But most of us would not have predicted that so soon after the G20 hoopla in Delhi, everything would go into free fall. Now, most observers say that the relationship between two friendly countries is at its lowest it has been in a long, long time. It all started when Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, stood up in Parliament and alleged that there were active links between agents of the Government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Khalistani activist whom India's National Investigation Agency had designated a terrorist and an absconder. India vehemently denied the allegations, but the controversy ballooned as India reacted with force, including a demand that Canada cut its diplomatic presence in India by 41 people. Since then, the whole saga has been playing out very differently in the two countries. In India, it's been seen as an example of a muscular, confident India who won't meekly cow down in the face of Western bullying. But how is it playing out in Canada? Is there a sense that Justin Trudeau has bitten off more than he can chew? And what does he hope to gain from it? Ujjal Dosanjh is the former Premier of British Columbia, the first person of Indian origin to lead a government in the West. He then became a federal minister in the government of Paul Martin and is the author of the books Journey After Midnight and The Past Is Never Dead. Ujjal Dosanjh joined us while on a visit to India. Ujjal Dosanjh, welcome to the show. Well, welcome back to the show.
Good to be back.
Hardeep Singh Nijjar, whose killing sparked this latest crisis, was supposedly organizing or involved in organizing an unofficial referendum up for an independent Sikh nation at the time of his death. Can you tell us a little bit of what that was all about? Who was voting?
Well, we don't know who is voting. At least I haven't seen the qualifications for voting. I'm assuming whether you're a Canadian citizen or not, if you happen to be Punjabi and Sikh, you probably are allowed to vote. But I am not aware of any independent observers or any lists from where people are voting. So it's a haphazard kind of a process from a distance. And Nijjar, I think, was not only involved in that, but there was some suspicion that he may have been involved in knocking off Malik, Ripdaman Malik, the Air India accused. And then it was initially thought that the hit on Nijjar may have been organized by Malik's people, because the two young men that have been arrested are sort of minor criminals in Malik's case. And Mr. Nijjar, I didn't know him. I didn't know of him except what I read in the papers. But lately, I've been seeing his pictures making the rounds on social media with AK-47s and also with a group of 12 or 13 men somewhere in a training camp, with all of them with covered faces and guns in their hands. So on the face of it, one could argue that he was involved in violent activity. Otherwise, why would you have guns? Why would you have pictures taken with AK-47s? But I have no personal knowledge of that. So,
and did his killing at that time also make very big news in Canada?
Well, it did, because at that time, his friends knew that he'd been talking to the intelligence in Canada, or rather the intelligence may have been talking to him, telling him that he was a target. Nobody told him, I'm assuming, who was targeting him. Perhaps they didn't want to tell him what the sources were. And so that information was, after his death, publicly available through his family. And that made the news. And the Khalistanis accused the government of India of murdering him at that time. I mean, nobody gave them any credence at that time. But obviously things changed. When the Prime Minister of a country stands up in Parliament and makes a very solemn and somber declaration, then one must assume that there is something. But so far, no evidence has been made public, so it remains to be seen what it is.
Yes, and that's something I've seen many people in India saying that, you made those allegations publicly. Now, where's the evidence? Did he kind of box himself into a corner there?
Oh, I think he did. I think that may not have been his intent. The escalation that happened from Indian side may not have been his intent either. And I think that there is wide sort of knowledge in Canada that the Globe and Mail was about to come up with a front page story, and they ran it by the government sources because they had some intelligence material in it and they didn't want to jeopardize any investigations. I think it was at that point that at least that's the story that Trudeau decided that he was going to handle it and get ahead of it. I think that there is general agreement, even in Canada, amongst people who know how things are done, that he may have kind of overreached in doing the way he did it. His foreign minister could have done it. A spokesperson for the foreign affairs ministry could have done it. The police could have done it. Intelligence could have done it. That wouldn't have been as high profile. But then, I don't know everything that he knows, and he hasn't shared much more than what he has said publicly, even with the Premier of British Columbia, where this happened, or with the leader of the opposition. So we're all operating in the dark, lending some credence to the allegation made by India that they haven't given India anything other than what's available publicly.
Do you think that he might have been hoping to gain anything politically because his numbers have not been very good?
Well, his numbers have been bad. And I think for the first couple of weeks, it helped him distract from the polling numbers, from the housing shortage, from other issues that were top of the mind in Canada. So everybody then began to talk about this for at least 2 to 3 weeks. And even now, with India escalating on the basis of this so-called parity of personnel between countries, I think that is still helping him a little bit. But I think within Canada, there are questions by people who have held high positions who said that perhaps he has harmed himself as the topmost interlocutor with India, at least, because it'd be very difficult for him to have discussions with India on this issue with the current allegations and counter-allegations that are being made. I mean, you have to look at it from the perspective of a Canadian politician who is sort of born and bred on the basis of the rule of law. I mean, Canada probably has never gone across borders and attempted to kill anybody, although I could be wrong. And it's been able to avoid all of that because it's sitting right next to the elephant called the United States of America, whose protective umbrella it has in terms of
who does that dirty work for it. So you don't need to
That's right. But born and bred in that environment, you want to make sure that you uphold the rule of law, both nationally and internationally. I think that may have been one driving factor in his mind. The other may have been political considerations, although I want to give him the benefit of the doubt that perhaps that wasn't top of mind. I think it was that he wanted to get ahead of it because of the Globe story that was coming and wanted to make sure people knew that he was in charge.
But how much credence is there to the perception here that because he is in a minority government, he is dependent on parties which include Khalistan supporters propping him up, and therefore he's sort of beholden to them, to that lobby, as it were?
He has been beholden to that lobby even without Jagmeet Singh propping him up. You should explain
who Jagmeet Singh is.
Well, Jagmeet Singh is the leader of the New Democratic Party, the third party that is propping him up. They have what's called a supply confidence and supply agreement, which means they wouldn't vote against the government or defeat the government unless they have huge disagreement. And so Jagmeet Singh himself is a Khalistani sympathizer. It took him several goes from Terry Molesky when he first became the leader to condemn Talvinder Parmar as the Air India bomber. He kept saying, well, we don't know who did it. He's the leader of a national party, and he wasn't prepared to condemn him. And also when he became the leader during that time, there was sort of a video making the rounds, and I saw it, where he was seen to be speaking at the Sikh Sovereignty Conference. That obviously clearly is a Khalistani platform. And from what he said, I gathered that he was in full support of it. And one of his people in a documentary said, and I've heard that in fact he and others of his ilk went into Canadian politics to litigate 1984. And he's a young guy. He was probably only a few years old in 1984. But that's a problem for the diaspora. Because people born and bred there, if somehow people are able to inject this anger and this grievance into their heads, there's no healing process for them. And then you get Jagmeet Singh at the end. But in terms of Mr. Trudeau, he, from the days of his leadership, even before Jagmeet propped him up, he was surrounded by Khalistanis during his leadership campaign and afterwards and in his cabinet. Sons and daughters of the Khalistanis were in his cabinet.
Is that unique to his party? I mean, you were a Liberal Party MP. How do other political parties in Canada react to the Khalistani lobby there?
Well, I mean, the New Democratic Party has its leader as who's a Khalistani sympathizer, at least. The Conservative Party, being somewhat, right-wing, I think they are more prone to not sympathize with the Khalistani supporters, although they have had a sprinkling of support from the Khalistanis in the past. I mean, some Khalistanis can be truly conservative. And the former Prime Minister who Trudeau defeated, Stephen Harper, he was a bit tough on them. He was very clear that he wasn't their friend. Where with Trudeau, he has never said that he is not the friend of the Khalistanis. One of the difficulties Indians have is in understanding why, Khalistanis are able to demand Khalistan in Canada. Well, that's a question of freedom of expression. I have no difficulty with that either, nor should you have any. However, when it goes into violence and trying to violently dismember a friendly country like India, then I think the leadership of that country has an obligation to say, look, you guys, you want Khalistan, you can say you want Khalistan. If you go into violence, that's not acceptable. Number 3, we don't support the dismemberment of a friendly democracy. They've never said that as clearly as I've been asking them to say that.
No politician, no big mainstream politician has said that.
I haven't heard anybody say that. Somebody may have said it privately somewhere, but I've not heard anybody publicly say that. And I think that's very important. And that's why I think India is partly somewhat concerned that the politicians are sort of mollycoddling these Khalistanis by not saying that kind of thing.
Do you think this is all also a part of the process or project to bring the Khalistan movement into a more regular mainstream in Canada and erase its violent past? Because I read an article which said that even Trudeau's government issues a statement every year to mark the National Day of Remembrance for Victims of Terrorism on the anniversary of the Air India bombing. And they call it the largest mass murder in Canadian history, but never mentions Khalistan. It's like that part is being erased.
Oh, of course it's erased. I think the reason they mark that, and they do it in a very low-key fashion. I was at the remembrance of that day this year in Vancouver at the memorial service. And I said clearly, Prime Minister and the Governor General have issued statements. Have they really gone to a remembrance ceremony and made a point of saying that this is the largest mass murder in Canadian history and unsolved so far? There was silence. So when the media reported it, they didn't report those comments that I made. And, there is this feeling that Trudeau and others are not rabidly arguing against dismemberment of India. And in fact, some of the elements that argue for dismemberment of India have found places in his government.
Now, just as in terms of fact check, we keep talking about Khalistan, but how big is the Indian or Punjabi community in Canada? And has anyone ever done any surveys to see how much support there is for the Khalistani movement there?
Well, I have always maintained that if you ask Khalistanis to stand in front of a camera and say you're a Khalistani, less than 2 or 3% of the people would ever say that. Less than 5 maybe. I read this Pew Research report which said that the Indian Sikhs, 95% of them feel rather extremely patriotic about India, being Indians. And I think it'd be the same in terms of Canadian Sikhs. If you ask them whether civilizationally they're proud of their Indian heritage, I think they would say the same thing. Because I walk around among circles and talk to people, and they all kind of dump on this fringe, which has now become more vocal than the last few years. And that may have something to do with ISI or other international issues, which I'm not aware of. But it has suddenly become more vocal than before, whereas in India, in fact, it's nowhere to be found. And so that, in fact, worries me because it's an international game that's being played. There are rumors and people talk about amongst themselves, in the privacy of their homes, at parties and other things, that there are drugs, there are gangs, there are separatism. This is all sort of a cocktail, a very dangerous cocktail that's brewing in Canada. You've had a murder in Winnipeg, I think, recently, and you've had Malik murdered, and you've had this Nijjar murdered. So that's like 3 murders related to gangs in Khalistan within the last year and a half.
And you would think that Prime Minister Trudeau's political opponents would seize on that and, just even as it's a free speech issue, as you're talking about, it also becomes a law and order issue.
Yeah, I think the Conservatives are worried about being painted with this wide brush of racism. I think there are lots of sensitivities that sort of go into their silence. And the other thing is, this is strategic silence too sometimes. If, let's say, there are 30,000 Sikhs in one riding, 5% of that would be a couple of thousand people. While some ridings are won or lost by a margin of 500 votes. So there's a strategic silence as well. And they perhaps would gain more because of that than by speaking out against this.
You spoke up against Khalistan from the get-go. Did that, even though you're not in active politics right now, did other Indian origin politicians in Canada follow in your footsteps in that regard? Absolutely not.
I mean, I spoke up regardless of what the political consequences were. I've never actually sought power for power's sake. So, I ran first 2 times in 79 and 83 because I was asked to run by the seniors in the political party. And then in 91, I ran for a different purpose, not for power. I was told the rumors were, he's politically dead. And I tried to figure out, how do you prove that you're not politically dead? So I ran for nomination. I defeated all the Khalistanis. So I've never worried about power. It doesn't matter at the end. I haven't seen other politicians do that. Many of the politicians, many of the MPs in the House of Commons, if you ask them privately, they will probably dump on the Khalistanis. But publicly, they dare not say anything for reasons best known to them.
Yeah, it's puzzling to many people who are watching it from outside. But you were attacked, obviously, physically for your role, for speaking up. You have the scars to bear for it. Maybe that's a deterrent for others to speak up. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that, I have seen, in fact, some of them, people who are raised in Canada, essentially born and raised in Canada, some of them, they are quick to criticize India, and sometimes legitimately, but they never raise their voice against Khalistani violence, against Khalistani extremism, against the dismemberment of India. So it's a very strategic kind of choice that they make.
Beyond the actual attacks that happened, the physical attack, what kind of pressure did you face for being a politician of Punjabi origin speaking up on this issue?
But, when I spoke out, I had run twice for the legislature. I was not an elected person at that time. But I also knew that if I spoke out, I would make enemies. And then if I ever wanted to run again, that would may pose a problem for me. But I didn't enter into my calculus at that point. And I've never allowed that to enter. That I come from a place of being very proud Indian civilizationally. And when I first got elected in 91, one of the journalists who happens to be born and raised Indo-Canadian in Canada said to me, so how do you look at yourself? How do you define yourself, right? And it took like a split second for me to say, look, I'm an Indian by civilization and culture. I'm a Punjabi by heritage and mother tongue. And I'm a Canadian by citizenship. And if at all someone is interested, I was born and raised in a Sikh family. It's not important for me. Religion ought not to be important in the public domain. One of the problems I think Canadian politicians don't realize that this dangerous cocktail of Khalistani/Sikh politics entering into the political arena in a fanatical way in Canada is very dangerous to the very idea of separation of church and state that Western societies worked so hard to establish. And I think that most Canadian politicians haven't sort of seriously thought about these issues, in the end, give it 200 years. They might want Khalistan in Canada. So, if the politicians want to prevent that kind of a possibility, they have to be very vigilant on the question of separation of church and state.
Which all leads to, the charges India keeps making that Canada is mollycoddling terrorists. But do you think Canada can realistically do some of the things the Indian government is asking it to do?
I don't think so. I mean, Canada is a different country. It's a different culture. I mean, Canada is not going to pick up somebody like the ED and the CBI and other people, just simply pick up somebody and take to prison and talk to them for 10 hours. In Canada, you have the right to silence. Nobody can ask you questions if you don't want to answer any questions. And you have to have reasonable and probable grounds to believe that either one has committed crime or you're about to commit a crime, and then the police can come in and talk to you. And Canadian police can't just sort of walk into your home saying, you were raising violent slogans and we're going to search your property or your home. Where they can act is on the question of hate speech. Some of these speeches that are made in some temples, like I have seen an excerpt of Nijjar's speech where he's glorifying Indra's killing and some other killings, and he's talking about some other people being killed. He called Malik a traitor. So when you see that kind of speech, it's almost bordering on hate speech. I'm not a legal analyst at this moment, but I think the police could perhaps do more because there are hate speech provisions in the criminal code in Canada. But the way Indian law and the Indian kind of thinking proposes, that will never be acceptable in Canada. It's like I've seen people being picked up left, right and center and being taken in dozens of them taken into custody. Canadians won't stand for that.
And for example, now after this recent case and escalation, there were reports of property of people marked as Khalistani sympathizers being seized in Punjab and places like that.
And that law is a carryover from the British days, where they wanted to do that to make sort of the patriots, cease and desist from patriotic activity. This is a law that doesn't belong on the books in India. I'm prepared to say that. This is far-reaching. It's really inhuman in a sense. In Punjabi, it's called kurki. They take away your property. And these are carryovers from a colonial era that should no longer be acceptable in a thriving democracy like India. I pass no judgment on whether or not the people they pick up or target are guilty or not of the crimes they say they are. But that law, it reaches too far into the personal lives of people.
And the other thing that immediately came up in a lot of Indian media after this incident was people started talking about how Justin Trudeau's father, the former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, was the one who had prevented turned down India's request for the extradition of a Khalistani extremist who was then later on implicated in the Air India bombing. Was this like father, like son? Are these comparable?
I don't think so. I think that allegation comes from some level of lack of knowledge on the part of those who make it. The question was about Talvinder Parmar and others. He was running away from Punjab, having killed some police officers in India, and he was in Germany, and India sought extradition. It wasn't done. Then India sought his extradition from Canada. The older Trudeau was the Prime Minister. India-Canada had no extradition treaty at that time. And countries don't extradite people unless there is a treaty that kind of binds them and regulates how you extradite. And it was subsequent to his departure from the political scene that Talvinder Parmar was implicated, under Prime Minister Mulrooney, implicated in the Air India explosion.
And what happened eventually, for people who haven't followed it, what happened eventually in the Air India case? Why did it fall apart?
Well, I think, there are many reasons. First of all, people like me were writing letters to the attorneys general, and others were doing the same thing, that there is a problem. There could be murders in Canada. They didn't believe us. I mean, there's an element of racism in this. I've said that publicly. If you had, white guys fighting on the streets and making threats to each other, they would pick you up. These were brown guys. Half of them didn't understand the language. They didn't understand the culture. So some of them thought, here's some brown guys, some with turbans, some without turbans, arguing with each other. As long as they don't harm anybody else, it's okay. It was only after the Air India thing happened in June of '84, which was about 4 months after the assault on me, that they perked up. At that moment, then they were confronted with the lack of police officers with the knowledge of culture and language, because the community was small. The police CSIS didn't know the culture, didn't know the language. They couldn't even translate the signals these people were sending to each other that were wiretap. And then they destroyed the wiretaps by mistake. So they bungled the entire investigation. Perhaps not deliberately so, but because of the lack of knowledge. And one person has been jailed for manufacturing the bombs for the Narita plane and the Air India plane. And others were prosecuted. Malik was prosecuted and Bagri was prosecuted. They were acquitted for lack of sufficient evidence. I think the original problem was the lack of extradition treaty. Now India and Canada have an extradition treaty, and two people were actually extradited for the murder of a young woman who had married against their wishes, family's wishes in India. So they organized the murder sitting in Canada, and then they were extradited to India, and they're facing trial. I don't understand why, if India has made formal extradition requests, I don't understand why they haven't been accepted by Canada. I mean, nobody said anything publicly about them in terms of the substantive cases. So it's difficult for one to say whether a formal request has been made, backed up by evidence, or it was just an informal request saying, here's the evidence, please send us these people.
Not just with Hardeep Singh Nijjar. After this recent incident, the former Chief Minister of Punjab, Amrinder Singh, also wrote an op-ed where he said, I gave all these names to Canada and nothing happened, no action happened. And I couldn't read between the lines to understand whether, again, as you say, they were just informally names being given, or were those formal extradition requests that had been turned down?
Well, a prime minister or a chief minister doesn't make the formal request for extradition. It goes through the legal channels, the courts and the police, and goes to the appropriate channels in Canada. And I don't know whether that's ever happened. Nobody's ever clarified that.
Seems like an obvious question somebody would have asked one side or the other, no?
I've been asking it, but I'm not a reporter.
I think I was watching something by Fareed Zakaria, and he quoted an Indian columnist as saying that it's ended up in this situation is, from the Indian perspective, if we did it, we were right because you guys were not acting on our complaints. And if we didn't, you were wrong. So what is that showing about the changing Indian attitude to this?
Well, I think the Indian attitude is crafted or formed based on the muscular foreign policy that Modi has been, strutting on the international stage. It may do some good to him domestically.
He has an election coming up.
Yeah. But in terms of the foreign influence India might exert in international affairs, it has a negative impact. Because if you are a big country, a powerful country, and if you did what Canada alleges you've done, gone across international borders and taken out a perceived or a real enemy of India, people might sort of on your face not say anything, but they won't respect you very much. Ultimately, countries like India will do well and better if they actually were the promoters of international rule of law, rather than saying, yeah, we did it, prove it or disprove it, we've done it. That's not my idea of India. I mean, I prefer the Gandhian and the Nehruvian approach, where if you have the power, let the power kind of speak silently.
What was it? Speak softly and carry a big stick.
Absolutely. And India has actually bared its fangs. I'm not suggesting that Canada is all, hunky-dory, no problems. But then you are, as a country, in danger of being a bit of a pariah on the international stage. Yeah, even though Americans have done this kind of thing umpteen times, Russians have done that. But the very people who've done that will be trying to denounce you on the international stages.
And I wonder if in some ways Mr. Trudeau has not helped Mr. Modi there, is he can go into an election campaign looking like the guy who stood up to Western bullies, even to protect India's national interests here or abroad.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's why that India is still kind of escalating the thing. I mean, India has now told 41 people to leave from the diplomatic corps because of the issue of parity. It seems to me there is a bit of domestic politics doing its rounds in this issue.
Do you think Trudeau really underestimated the Indian response?
I think he did. You see, my argument is that he did, because if he had realized where it could go, then he would have been better off to have his foreign affairs minister or some security person make the statement. Even if he wanted to get ahead of the story, he could have done it some other way. Just issued a written statement or something. But to go into a house, the House of Commons, and make a somber declaration alleging wrongdoing on the part of another country, well, the country is going to react. Whether you're weak or powerful doesn't really matter. Even a weak country would react, and India is not perceived to be weak.
Now, you have also said that when you go to places like Punjab, there are a lot of problems there, but Khalistan is not so much the overriding number one pressing urgent issue on people's minds.
In Punjab, the issue is unemployment, poverty, lack of jobs, drugs, gangsterism, weapons and drugs coming in from Pakistan via drones. That's the problem. Khalistan is not a problem in Punjab. Khalistan is now purely a Western problem, in the sense that it will survive in Canada, UK, and perhaps Germany like a rootless thing, because people carry the grievances or aspirations in their heads, unmodulated by the realities on the ground. Punjabis and the Sikhs in Punjab or India don't have an obligation to do anything on it. Some people argue, why are other Canadians not speaking out, or why are other Sikhs or Indians not speaking out against these elements in Canada? People don't realize, we all have to make a living. We have children, grandchildren, families to look after, issues of unemployment, issues of healthcare, education, all of those issues. We live there. It is not our fight. In Canada, India should not accept the Indian diaspora to fight the bad elements in it. Because if you do that, then the way you have sort of the muscular Hindu Rashtra politics, it is already actually impinging on the internal politics of the diaspora in places like Canada. I've never seen, until Mr. Modi came on the scene, I've never seen Indian community divided based on the domestic politics of India abroad, in the diaspora. And now, in fact, you have the diaspora talks using the same language that is being used domestically. In a sense, whether consciously or unconsciously, Mr. Modi's conduct internationally or even domestically has weaponized the diaspora. That's very dangerous for us. We want to live a peaceful life in a country called Canada. That's where I am. And we wish India well. But fighting the Khalistanis is not my fight. It's not the ordinary Indian's fight. It's not even the ordinary Canadian's fight, unless it moves over into the question of a rule of law and law and order. It is a fight that India needs to figure out how to engage in. And it is not going to eliminate Khalistani grievances in Canada or UK or the US, Australia, by physically targeting or assassinating people who promote Khalistan. In fact, nobody knew Mr. Nijjar. Now Mr. Nijjar is an icon amongst them.
Yeah, because that leads to the feeling that you would think that something like what happened during the heyday of the Khalistan movement in 1984. Years have passed since then. Many of the people involved are gone. The usual perception is, as a new generation comes of age in a country like Canada or America, they are more removed from the baggage that their parents carried, right? But in this case, it seems the grievance becomes part of the inheritance of this new generation, because many of these people coming up were not really around during the actual Khalistan movement or the 1984 bombings and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. What happens is the grievances kind of remain in your head. They don't need kind of the Punjabi roots or the Indian roots. And that's why they're very, very much more difficult to deal with. If you carry a grievance in your head about a country 15,000 miles away, with which you have nothing to do right now, you continue to infuse this hatred into the minds of youngsters. And some of the youngsters born and raised in Canada carry this thing in their heads, like Mr. Dhaliwal. I mean, he's born and raised in Canada, going to some of the richest schools and private schools in the United States. He talks that lingo. That is very dangerous. There's no healing process that takes place. You come to India, you meet Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs, you have dinners together, you intermarry, you live next to each other. There's a healing process that takes place, saying, oh, I now realize they're not all my enemies. Yeah, some people are bad. Yeah, there's always criminal element, right? But there is no such thing in Canada because they live in their own homes. Khalistani talk to Khalistanis and anti-Khalistanis talk to anti-Khalistanis. It's not anti-Khalistanis fight to fight. They can't carry on fighting a phantom. It is, in a sense, a phantom, and there's no root there anymore. I have no evidence, but there's also a perception people talk about that elements of this movement in Canada, UK, and Australia are involved in the drugs and gangs as well. That kind of somehow fuels the whole thing as well.
This is like fighting a phantom, which is a phrase I really liked. What would be the end game of the phantom?
The end game of the phantom remains constant. That is to destabilize India. It started after the 71 war with Jagjit Singh Chauhan, and it has never stopped. The idea of Khalistan pre-existed 1984. 1984 just sort of gave it more steam. And it shall continue to exist as long as ISI money continues to be funneled. And countries like Canada and US and UK either don't have the wherewithal or don't have the evidence to prosecute these people. If they're simply standing and asking for Khalistan, there's nothing you can do. If you are engaging in hate speech and violent activities, both of those are prosecutable. And Canadian politicians and Canadian law enforcement officials just have to be more vigilant in that regard.
So when you say you can't prosecute someone for standing up and, holding up a Khalistan poster, but what about the recent allegation that was, I think, in some kind of parade in Surrey or somewhere, they had posters lauding the killers of Indira Gandhi. The foreign minister complained about that. Is that something that was actionable?
I don't think so. That is not hate speech. That is just stupidity. You're standing up and you're saying, yeah, you did a good thing. I mean, one could make a roundabout argument, circular argument that, that's promoting violence or condoning violence. That'd be difficult to uphold in the court of law. But if you stand and you say, we killed Indira Gandhi and we killed so-and-so, we will kill the enemies of Khalistan. Now that, when you say we will kill the enemies of Khalistan, then you're creating hate speech. That is prosecutable, at least in my view.
What kind of conversations have you had with other Canadians of Indian origin since everything blew up? I mean, this must be very weird time for them. Simple things like someone planning a trip in next February to India who doesn't have an OCI card saying, I don't know if I'll be able to go because they're not issuing visas.
Oh, no, Indian community is going through an incredible degree of pain. I mean, people have weddings and, they want to sell their land or they want to come do something else. Hundreds of thousands of them come to India every year. And it's a very difficult time for them. They're sort of the meat in the sandwich. There is no resolution. I mean, I think that there's no question that with the kind of posters, the wanted and assassinate posters about the Indian officials, in the Indian consular officials, that India perhaps had to worry about their security. But I think India should speak to Canada. Canada should provide security and they should actually begin to process these visas for innocent human beings who just want to come back and visit their ancestral land.
Yeah, because then otherwise you have basically collective punishment.
Absolutely.
But given that this has started from such a high level, do you think this will die down soon? Do you see any signs of a way out, any glimmers of light?
I do, in a sense, because after 41 people have been told to leave from the High Commission, Canada really hasn't retaliated in any way, shape or form. In fact, the Prime Minister, and I have to admire him for that, he said, we're not looking to escalate the situation. I think by that he meant, however dumb I may have been or however, improperly I may have dealt with this issue, I'm not looking forward to escalating this.
Yeah, but with both Prime Ministers up for facing re-election soon, I assume that saving face or preventing loss of face will be huge on both sides.
I think Trudeau has more maneuverability in that situation because he has 2 years to go unless Jagmeet Dhaliwal pulls the rug from under him. Whereas Mr. Modi goes to the polls by May, June. So I think that's more of a problem for Mr. Modi than Mr. Trudeau.
Do you think that it is realistically possible that that they might pull the rug from him on this issue in terms of the support of the NDP?
I doubt that very much. I mean, Mr. Singh or Dhaliwal, whatever his name is, one or the other, I think that he wouldn't be inclined to do that on this issue. He might be inclined to do that on issues that are important to the NDP caucus itself. My sense is that he has one more election to go. He may or may not survive the next election. If his numbers go up and the seats go up, he may survive another term. Otherwise, the NDP might change leadership.
You came to India on this trip before this whole thing blew up?
No, I came just a few days ago.
Oh, yeah.
After the things.
So I was really curious whether when you put that Canadian passport at immigration, did people look at you?
I spoke to someone who's in the know in Canada, and I said to the person, I said, am I safe? So I think the person talked upstairs in Canada to people, yeah, Mr. Dosanjh, you're safe. Don't worry, you're safe. I said, okay.
I don't think anyone would have predicted that there would be a time in India where someone might look at a Canadian passport askance and
I know
and size you up. But these are strange times.
Yeah.
I wish you a safe journey back, and please do stay safe. Thank you for joining us.
And good chatting with you.
Former Premier of British Columbia and Federal Minister Ujjal Dosanjh is the author of the memoir Journey After Midnight, a Punjabi life from India to Canada, and the novel The Past is Never Dead. Send us your thoughts about this show wherever you get your podcasts from. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. Thanks as always for listening. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.